Good morning and welcome to 2019. It is January 2nd and we are with me. I am Eileen Cook and we are in the happy hour. So we are going to talk all things, and we have two things up on the plate today. So we're going to split them up fairly evenly. So we have from Bonnie G some questions around TED Talks, and then we're going to switch gears at 9:30 and turn over to Tony, who has done and those who know Tony are not surprised, who have done a spreadsheet with his outline and all those kinds of things. So we're going to jump first into Bonnie's, where Bonnie raised the question about doing a TED Talk. And how many people are familiar with the idea of TED Talks? I'm pretty sure everyone is at this point. They have become somewhat of a phenom. They're extraordinarily popular. There are both local TED Talks as well as the one big, large one. And I think what's important to start with is their tagline, which is ideas worth spreading. And I think that's the thing that you're going to need to go back to as you think about doing any kind of TED Talk, which is that's their mandate. So how do you come up with an idea that is worth spreading? We're going to focus particularly on TED Talks, but I want to make sure that people understand there's a lot of takeaways here if you are thinking about pitching any sort of conference with any kind of talk, that this can be helpful. And even in a much bigger kind of thing, which is how do you spin an idea in an original way that hopefully makes people pay attention to it? So we've already had the discussion before, and people know there's only so many ideas out there. So often you're kind of retelling an idea, hopefully with your own spin on it. And how do you know if you do that? So Bonnie, I'm curious, what makes you interested in doing a TED Talk?
I've always wanted to do a TED Talk. I think I have a lot of ideas that are worth spreading. I love doing speaking. And just on a more practical note, like for my business kind of note, as an author, I think it's a great thing to do and then have available for people to look at. I think it's a great tool for getting gigs, honestly.
Yes. Yeah. And I mean, I think
I'm a good public speaker and I have a lot to share, and some of it I want to share in books, but I think this is another way to have an audience and share what I have to share.
And I want to kind of break down both of those things, because I think as writers, we're often very keen. We want to share. We have ideas that we want to share, and conferences or TED Talks are a great way to do that. But there is nothing wrong with owning the idea that we're often speaking at conferences and TED Talks because of promotional purposes, whether that's a business that we do, such as the Creative Academy. Like, we have been out and talking at conferences, and you better believe that I mention in my bio every single time, and I'm part of the Creative Academy, whether we're using that to promote our books, right? So, and it's not surprising, I've spoken at a number of conferences, and I've also been at conferences where I've just been a part of the book selling phenom, where you have your books available at the conference. And what I can tell you is if you are a speaker and you have your books available, you will sell far more books than if you are just at the book selling thing.
Right.
So for people who may not know, TED Talks are short. So you're typically looking, they say 18 minutes, which really means you probably have about time for one main idea that you're trying to get across. So that is something that you're going to want to keep in mind. Even if you are speaking at a conference where you have a much larger thing, so you might be speaking where you have 45 minutes or 90 minutes, sometimes even up to 2 or 3 hours, depending on the conference that you're at. But in most cases, they're going to limit you to 45 minutes to 90 minutes. You're going to have to figure out what is it that is the most important thing that you want people to walk away from. And I usually use that as a starting point for myself. So most recently, when I was at the Surrey conference, I did a talk on backstory. And one of the things that I put down for myself was the most important issue was it's not what happens to people, it's the narrative they tell themselves about what happens to them. So it's not that someone grew up in foster care, it's what they tell themselves about growing up in foster care. It's not that you lived through the Holocaust, such as Viktor Frankl did. It's the message that he took from living through that situation that gave what he was saying power. So that was my takeaway in that talk. And every time I made a point, I tried to circle back around that. I'm also a very honest person around, hang on, I'm going to yell at my dog silently. I did that on mute so you didn't have to hear that. I often tell people straight out, this is what I want you to take away from this talk. If you remember nothing else, remember this thing. So it's not that it's a secret, but thinking about what is the core idea and principle. With a TED Talk, you're asking yourself, how can you give people a reason to care? Can you raise a question for them, something that they want to know, some sort of gap in their knowledge? So what is that thing that is going to pull them into it? If you're speaking at a writing conference and you're doing something on craft, you have the advantage that people care because they've already paid to come to a writing conference and they're wanting, and they've probably looked at what's on the schedule and chosen. So you have a little bit of an advantage there. But if you're doing a TED Talk, and particularly when you're trying to get your TED Talk selected to be chosen, you have to think about what's going to make people care about that. So one thing that you can think about doing is starting at a different place. So one of the questions that I put as a prompt is there an assumption I would like to challenge? Something that people sort of assume is true that I would like for people to think about in a different way. So if you look at TED Talks, they have things like, we are doing social assistance all wrong. Do I want to say that, you know what, people are, the assumption is that you're born a writer. And I'm going to challenge that. I don't think that's true. I don't think there are people who are born writers. I think you become a writer. Or I'm going to challenge the idea that you have to outline in order to write a mystery, which is a commonly held assumption. So is there an assumption that you want to sort of tackle? Is there something for you that is personal, a belief that you had that has somehow changed? And again, if you're speaking at a writing conference, is there something that you always did that somewhere along the way you changed how you did that and you want to share that with someone else? If you're an expert in a particular area, is there something that people miss or assume when they think about what you do? Why do you think it's important for people to know this? Is there a problem that you can solve? Is it relevant to now? Is there some reason people need to know this thing now? So it really comes down to, and what I want to challenge people with is, what is your idea? So again, we're going back, TED Talks are ideas worth spreading. So what is your idea? And I'm going to challenge you that ideas are not just a general truth. So if I say, well, I want to do a TED Talk on writing as a way to get out your creativity, to express your creativity. It's not really an idea. That's just sort of a truth. That just sort of is. If I say writing is a way to save your life, that's an idea. And then I need to argue about why I believe that is in fact true. For those of people who were able to make the Creative Academy retreat, and if you didn't, you can catch it on record. One of the things we talked about when we were doing goal setting was to be audacious, which I think is a wonderful word to sort of use and play with. But I think this is true when doing something like a TED Talk, which is, how can you be bold? How can you make a statement that's not wishy-washy? And I think, and I'm going to challenge the women in the room, possibly more than Tony, I think women, we tend to quantify things too much. That this is somewhat, or just, or a little, or this might be helpful, or this can be the truth, or I mean, maybe not your truth. But I think if you're going to stand up on a stage and you're going to have 18 minutes, then you need to be bold and you need to be audacious and you need to state what your idea is. So if you're not sure what your idea is, then of course the best way to start with that is just plain out brainstorming. So you might be doing some kind of mind mapping. So people have done that before, where you put something in the center of the page and then you just start seeing what ideas come off of it. A friend of mine, if she has a random idea, she opens the dictionary at large. she picks a word and she sees if she can connect that word to her idea, because she finds that that sort of jogs her creativity. If someone knows nothing about your topic or very little about your topic, you might ask them, what is it that they would like to know? So say to someone, I'm really interested in doing a topic about this particular person in history. So I'm going off, a Bonnie might be like, I really want to talk to people about this particular woman, and say to someone like, have you ever heard of her? No. Well, what would make her interesting to you? So you know why you find her interesting. So if someone has no idea about her, what is it that they might find interesting? Something that I do often when I'm writing just a short story is thinking about the what if game. Well, what if this happened? What if that happened? And we'll play that a little bit later with Tony's outline. But I think it's also useful for a TED Talk. What if this person in history had never lived? What would have been the outcome? Why does it matter? What if I was this person? What if this situation were to happen again? How would people respond? Playing what if is a good question. What and why are some of my favorite writer questions. So, why does it matter that we know this person? What am I missing in my life if I've never heard about that person? How will knowing about that individual change how I possibly interact with the world? And those I recognize are some high bar kinds of questions, but those are, that's TED Talks, right? Where people walk out feeling inspired and thinking about how they do things. You may take something that you have and turn it upside down. So one of my most popular speeches that I give at writing conferences is where I take conflict resolution techniques and I turn them upside down to show how you can use those in the opposite way to increase conflict in a story. So for example, in conflict resolution, we talk about if I have an issue with Bonnie, rather than raise it in office hours, I would say, Bonnie, can we meet later? I wanted to talk to you about something, blah, blah, blah. And that's a much better way to do it. So obviously, if I want to increase conflict because this is a novel and not real life, I would call Bonnie out right in the middle of office hours, right? Because that's going to raise the stakes. So that's an example of sort of turning something upside down that for people, they tend to resonate with it because they tend to have been in some sort of workshop at some point that talked to them about conflict resolution. So the idea of sort of switching that around for people tends to be really useful. When you're coming up with the talk, I think it's easier to start with both your beginning and your end and then fill in the middle. Other people may feel differently. They may find the middle the easiest part. But for me, if I can nail down how I want to start, that's useful. And that's the idea that you want to have something that's going to grab people's attention. Even if later you do go back and change it. I often find when I'm writing a book, I can't really get going on it until I have a great opening line. Even though I know 98% of the time I end up changing that opening line because by the time I write the end of the book, I know more about the beginning. But for me, there's something about feeling like I have something that's really compelling that will pull people in. Think about how you want to end. TED Talks in particular, I think the ones that are the most shared, the ones that resonate, have some sort of positive, happy ending. There's some sort of call to action that people are wanting to do. They're thinking about things. They're excited, right? Even if you're doing a regular conference, I think there's something to be said for what is it you want people walking out with? And again, I tend to, in most of my workshops, tell people this is the main takeaway that I want you to think about when you're leaving. I want them to have laughed in the middle of the talk because I think people learn more when they're laughing. So those are some of the things that you need to think about. Think about how you're going to organize your talk. So again, in TED Talks, people are typically doing this experientially, so they're just speaking. So, but you don't necessarily have to do that. Some people have index cards. Some people have various things, like however it is you're going to do. I typically have practiced my talk enough that I'm typically speaking off off note, but I always have my notes there because I'm terrified at some point I may have a brain lock and have no choice but what to do it. For something like a TED Talk, you're probably going to need to trim once you sort of know what everything that you want to include. Think about if you're going to have slides or visuals that you're going to be using. Some do's and don'ts. I think it's important to be really confident. It's okay to tell people that you're nervous, but if you're standing up in front of a crowd, then you're going to want to do that. Now, I know for Bonnie, she's done a ton of public speaking, so this might be advice for other people. It's okay to admit to someone like, oh, I'm nervous to be up here, or wow, there's a lot of you. You can sometimes make a joke, like nothing personal, those of you in the front row, but I'm totally picturing you in your underwear right now. Anything that might sort of help you kind of get over that. But remember that you are the person who is on the stage. People have come to see you, and so they're expecting you to sell yourself as an expert in that area. I think it's important to include the audience. That doesn't mean that necessarily that you have to call on them or ask them questions, although you might, but make sure that you are making eye contact occasionally. I tend to pick a couple people in the room, so I tend to look at sort of 3 different areas. If I'm someplace like the Surrey conference where there are people that I know, I will pick a particular person. So Tony was in one of my workshops at Surrey. I know Tony, I like Tony. So I will tend to look over at him because it will kind of give me that like, okay, I got this feeling. That just helps me. So if you don't know anyone in the audience, then you're trying to maybe spot a couple people who are looking at you and are particularly engaged. That will sort of help you out. If you're not comfortable with public speaking, then practicing out loud is useful. Give your talk to your dogs, your cats, your closet door. If you can enlist your family and friends. Once you have actual people who will respond, like family and friends, you can ask them, did they like it? What worked for them? Were there any parts that they were confused? Any parts where they lost interest? All those things will help you out a little bit. Consider recording yourself. It's so easy now with iPhones. Just prop your iPhone up on your mantelpiece, give your talk, and then play it back and watch it. There are certain things that you'll notice and that you can sort of work on. Again, for just general public speaking things, I know that, and I've had to train myself a little bit out of using my hands all the time because it looked like I was trying to do interpretive dance at the front of the room. So I'm much better now about doing that. I'm better, though, still working on verbal pauses, things like so I try to trim some of those kinds of things out. If you have a set amount of time, you need to figure out how that's going to work. So this is also very useful if you ever have to do a book reading. So they will often tell you, we'd like you to, read from your book for 2 or 3 minutes or a 5-minute reading. Very rarely I've been asked to do a 10-minute reading. They're usually looking for fairly short. You actually need to time yourself and figure out how long that is. So going into your book and marking, this is a 2-minute reading, this is a 5-minute reading, and practicing it under a little bit of stress if you can. Again, I tend to speak faster when I'm stressed. So having that kind of thing can sort of help a little bit. So I always tend to have different versions of my speech depending on how things go. If I look up and I realize like, oh my God, we're running out of time, then I have already thought out what are the things at the end of my talk that could go if they needed to. Conversely, I always have some additional content. So sometimes I think, well, I'm going to open this up for questions, and then there's going to be a chance for feedback. And then all of a sudden, no one has any feedback. And all of a sudden I realize like we still have 30 minutes to go and I'm almost completely through the content that I thought would take an hour. So being able to spread that out a little bit. Some things not to do: don't let other people take over your talk. This can sometimes happen. It's not going to happen at a TED Talk because they will hustle those people out. But if you are something at a writing conference, there are sometimes people in the audience that will, I don't want to say hijack a speech, but suddenly, Bonnie's nodding yes. Sometimes where all of a sudden they're like, well, I bet what the audience would really like to do is hear my version of what I think. And the truth of the matter is the audience, maybe they would, but you know what? They're not the person on the bill, you are. And again, I think this is sometimes difficult for some people where you might feel rude to sort of cut someone off or to say, I'm going to have to stop you there. I'm afraid we're going to hear from, we need to hear from some other people now. That sounds really interesting. Why don't we talk after my talk? But you need to shut that down, or you can have someone take over your talk and suddenly they're talking for 10 or 15 minutes. Whether that's them attempting to be the expert, or though in most cases what it is someone who's like, I'd now like to tell you the entire plot of my book so that you can help me figure it out. And that is not the time or the place for that. If you do have slides or some kind of visuals, I think those are great and people really enjoy them. Please, for all that is holy in life, do not just read your slides to people. Very few things drive me more crazy than being at a talk where someone is basically just reading their slides aloud. I once was in a talk where the person actually was reading along, and then basically they told a joke, and then they said, pause for laughter. And then they laughed really, like they actually were just reading their speaker notes word for word. That just doesn't make you a very compelling speaker. So please don't read your notes. Please do not try to cram 40 minutes of material into 5 minutes. So I think we've all been in this kind of workshop where you're in a workshop and the person says, oh my God, we only have 10 minutes left. And then all of a sudden the slides are moving at like this rocket space. And they're like, and then this, and then this, and then this, and then this, and everyone's scrambling to write things down. If you suddenly look up and you realize that the talk went sideways on something and you spent way more time than you thought on a particular topic, just acknowledge that that's the way it went. Perhaps you say to people, I have further things to say. I'm going to post those on my blog, or you can email me, those kinds of things. One thing that I am terrible about, but I am trying to get better, is to end with some kind of call of action if there's something that you want. So in a TED Talk, if you're asking someone to say or do something differently, then ask for that. If you are a writer, this is a time where you can say, I'll be available at the book signing on Saturday night. I'd love to see some of you there. There's nothing wrong with a certain amount of shameless self-promotion, as long as you are not the person who just can't shut up. So if every example that you give in your talk is, and another thing I did in my book, what you'll see in my book is, you're going to drive people nuts. And the truth of the matter is, unless you are Margaret Atwood or Diana Gabaldon, most people in the audience haven't read your book. So giving examples from your book is not necessarily illuminating and helping things at all. It's just confusing things because they don't know what it is. But it is okay at the end to say, I have several of my books available downstairs. If you'd like to check them out, that would be great. Also, if you have any questions about the Creative Academy, then blah, 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 blah. Just keep it short and sweet. I know that Bonnie G had to run because she had students coming, but she is going to listen to the rest of this later. I am happy if she wanted to do some thinking about a particular idea, helping her brainstorm and nail down an idea. So Bonnie, if you have one, and I know you have several ideas, but if there's one in particular you're thinking is kind of your best one, why don't we'll arrange to have you come to an office hour and we can sort of tackle what it is. For everybody else, I'm going to throw down a challenge. I know some of you, I think, Tony, are you speaking at Creative Inc.?
No.
No. For some reason,
not that I've been. No, not this time.
But you have in the past, or am I imagining that?
You're imagining it.
Oh, okay. Then I'm going to put out a challenge for people to start doing that, particularly Tony, as you are now going to be flogging a book out into the world.
Yes.
Putting yourself out at conferences and so forth. If you don't have a ton of speaking experience at writing conferences, one of the best ways that you can start that is contact your local library, let them know you're an author, you have a book out. I typically, what I did is I started doing it for free. In general, I don't advocate writers working for free, but if you're trying to get some amount of sort of credits. So I did several library talks, and libraries are great examples of places where they are trying to get content. So I offered to come and speak, gave them a topic, I did that, and then librarians do talk to other librarians, so they ended up sharing my name. Thank you for that echo. All right. Any questions on public speaking stuff? Okay. And Bonnie, I know you're going to do great at it. Yes, you are. You're going to be particularly great at school talks is my prediction. So, all right, I want to switch gears. Tony did an Excel spreadsheet on day and night. Tony, do you have it up where you could share it?
Yeah, let me just.
So I'm not surprised Tony did a spreadsheet, because that's the way Tony, the best is he sent an email. He was like, I'm not sure if you do anything like this, to which I was like, bah! Like, I love that you think that. I want to do things like this. I like the concept of doing things like this.
Well,
And
yeah,
yet,
I was more curious of if you've got a complex plot, what you do, how do you manage it?
yes. And I am very old school. So Bonnie's doing it all in her head. I do like index cards. And to be honest, I'm basically doing a lot of what you did here, just in index cards. Other than I might have a bit more scene breakdown. So.
Okay, let me share my screen here. Yep, you have to turn that on for me.
Oh, do I?
Yeah.
Tony, I do Excel too, so it's not all just in my head.
I think you can do it now.
Okay. Yeah.
So Tony, why don't you just walk us through what you've done?
So, so I've got what I believe is a kind of a complex thriller, and I did the second half of the thriller at Nano in November, and I've been going through, and before I started any editing, I was basically creating the synopsis and kind of the plot points, making sure that the plot sort of fit, so that I don't get to the end of it and go, oh, what happened to this character? What happened to this thing? So I looked at a bunch of different templates. This was a template that I think was based on the Save the Cat screenplay template. And so this description on the side, this is from the template, and then what I did is I added into my the opening image, a little synopsis of the opening image, and then on the notes side I have I've sort of identified the different subplots within the story.
So I went through this yesterday. So I think this is a great way to do it. And Save the Cat, I think, is a great one. But if people don't like it, there are certainly other ways that you can sort of structure that. But you need some way, if you have a complex plot, to do exactly what you're saying. So again, I do old school index cards, but it's basically the same process. My only thing that I would suggest is I think for some of these, you're going to need to break it down into more details.
Right.
Like opening image is going to be a short one, but there are others where I think there's going to be multiple scenes
right.
that are included in that.
Right. Yeah, I've tried to, like almost like a synopsis.
Yeah.
I was trying to narrow it down so that I could get the high level view of the story.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be a case of if you can, keep the same structure and then have maybe almost bullet points in the scene areas that might be different scenes would oscillate, because there may be a couple of subplots that are covered in different scenes that might still all fall into one section.
Right.
And then I think you can look at things like under number 2, the theme stated. What is the theme? Not to ruin your day, and you don't have to answer in this moment, but that was
no. Well, and that was part of the question I've got. So the the top level theme is, he saves the girl, right? Saves the little girl.
I'm going to say that's not a theme.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Merry Christmas.
You're welcome.
But the theme that I thought I was working on was, so he starts off with no money, paid very low, right? He's unhappy, and he's thrust into a world of extravagance and lots of money, and then he's given a job that he's being paid lots of money, and then so it's a bit of theme is sort of money can't buy happiness was kind of the
that's the theme.
Yeah.
And then, and the reason I'm maybe, teasing you or giving you a hard time about that is I think if you write it down, for example, in the notes section,
right,
money doesn't buy happiness.
Right.
Then I think there are times where you can look through and be like, where he thinks it does, right? Because you're going to be showing different elements of that theme, right? Because that'll be the end that we're going to circle back to. But initially, like in these opening scenes where he's coming back to his crappy low rent apartment,
right,
he's going to be thinking money does buy happiness.
Right.
Right.
Right. Yeah. So that's kind of what was coming out in the writing was that he's got the memories of an ex-spy, but he's got the bank book of a 22-year-old that isn't paid very well, right?
Because I think with the complex plot, what helps is to figure out where are places that I can go back to that thing. So one of the things I had in my notes was, one, state the theme here. And then as you're in different scenes, think about, are there other places where that theme is coming up? And you can either be showing different sides of it or in some way reinforcing it. And then also, like one of the things is, hang on, I'm looking through my own notes here. In number 11, if you can scroll us up there.
Yep.
Number 11, he lands in Tokyo and he realizes the spy whose memories are locked in his head has been to Tokyo before, so he knows some Japanese and so forth. This is the first point in this outline, which granted is, and I'm, in fairness, you're definitely trying to do big, high picture stuff.
Right.
But it's the first time in this outline where you mention that he has, again, the callback that there's this other part of those memories that are inside of himself. Right. So then going back and being like, okay, are there other places where that needs to come up?
Yeah. And it is in other spots, but that was, because it's also this one here. This is sort of the midpoint when she's abducted at the ballet, so that happens. And he also
there's one where, hang on, I'll have it down here.
He's actually
number 8.
Okay.
For me was another place. So, he's teaching this young girl dance, but he's starting to notice weird things with her and at work.
Yeah.
And I think that would be a place to show the dichotomy where maybe some of the things he's noticing is because the spy within him notices them.
Right.
Because I think one of the really fun things that I loved about your first book and that I'm looking forward to in this book is, and we talked about this, is, here you have this kid who is 22 years old, he's an artist, he's a dancer, and inside of him, he has this basically hitman spy.
Yep.
So it's the fun of that dichotomy that's sort of playing out.
Yep. And it's more of a subtle thing because he tells Fitzsimmons up front that no memories are gone, but he's waking up at night in cold sweats. He's not getting the overt kind of voice in his head, but the stuff is still there, and he's trying to ignore it.
And I think the interesting thing for him would be, is that the spy within me, or is that my own because we also have for ourselves our own internal debate that's going on.
Right.
Now, have you ever heard of the mice quotient or Mary Robinette Quell's talk on that?
I've heard it, and I can't tell you what it is.
That's fair. I will find you some extra resources on that. I know that Bonnie Jacoby has had several, was in that workshop with her on the cruise, I'm pretty sure. But one of the things that she talks about is sort of looking at where you're going to close out certain things.
Right.
Right. So you're raising certain subplots, and then you're going to want to make sure that you're closing out certain subplots. And the mice quotient is really the idea that that is done in a particular order.
Right.
Bonnie, did you want to jump in here at all?
Not really, because I always forget what they are.
Yeah, I'm totally brain locked on it at the moment, so I don't want to say it and then have it wrong and have Mary Robinette haunt me to the days of my
Emma's milieu.
Yeah, but it is the idea that, as you opening one, you're going to need to close down the others.
They're nested. They're nested, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So thinking about that, I think is sort of interesting things because, the primary plot, which is the big one, which is he needs to save Layla. Leela or Layla?
Leah.
Leah.
Yeah.
Or, Leah. That's good too.
Yeah.
Like that is, if someone was going to summarize this book in one or two lines, it's going to be like when David is called again, to use his spy knowledge, he must save Leia from certain, like that is the big major plot that's going on.
Right.
Then there's his own plots about what he's going to do, the subplot with sort of money and status. There's the problems around kind of the Japanese mafia, which is really fun. So there's different things that are sort of woven into those. And then some things like under number 13, there's a Razor David subplot. So Razor, who's a character in book 1, is pissed off because the injury stopped him from dancing and so forth. One, I love this callback because I think when you're writing a series like this, you want to have some of these characters that sort of show up here and there. Mm-hmm. But I'm not sure if this is a subplot or just something that's happening within the book. And I don't know if this is the only time where we're going to be seeing Razor. Mm-hmm.
This is where he shows up, and he does help in a couple spots in the second half of the book.
Yeah.
But that would be. I liked how he sort of showed up as I was writing it, because that was completely, unintentional.
Surprise! That's the beauty of Nano.
Yeah, exactly.
I like that he shows up. I like that there's a callback to that kind of thing. But for me, I guess I wonder if some of the subplot really isn't about Razor. Razor is just sort of another thing, which is around kind of, because money is part of David's subplot, but it's really about finding purpose, right?
Mm-hmm. It is. That's exactly. That's a good way to say it. It's sort of because he's a bit. He's dancing, and he's kind of, okay, is this all there is?
Yeah. And I think because that then nests this in where Razor becomes, a way of sort of showing to someone what happens if you lose what you think is your purpose.
Right. Oh, I like that.
So I just wanted to add in here, I don't know if this might help you or not, Tony, but I tend to put the subplots as extra lines in the spreadsheet, and then I use the same, key points. So if your subplot is hitting a theme, you'll put that in your subplot column. So you'll have all the subplots listed, like a Razor David subplot or a money subplot.
In a column?
Yeah, in a column. And then you can see whether or not it's a full subplot or if it's just a character interaction. Because sometimes it's hard to tell. If it's going to be a subplot, it will hit a few of those points. Like it may happen in the opening scene, and it might have a theme of its own, and it might happen during the midpoint. And it's like, so you can see where they're kind of tying together or overlapping, or even where they're missing the boat. And you're going, oh, if I move this interaction over here, it makes the conflict hit these two subplot points too, and then it's just strengthens it. So it's a tool for seeing if your subplot is actually really strong enough.
Do you have an example of on what you're writing? I'd love to see it.
You'd like to see it.
if it's in a shape to be able to see.
It's not in right now because
Okay.
I'm on my iPad, and that's all the way upstairs.
Well, no, not right this second, but if you could post that or send it or whatever, that would be great
Sure.
to see, because I was sort of looking at, okay, and this was part of my initial question to you, Eileen, is, well, how do you, when you have a complex plot and story, how do you manage all the threads?
Yeah. And I don't know if there is, I mean, I think what you're doing is exactly how I think the technique for doing it, whether that's on a spreadsheet or index cards, or, you know, if someone's doing it all in their head, but you need some way to sort of dump out. And that's why I think for me, I would break out in your D column a few more of the scenes into even just bullet point detail.
Right. Okay.
Just because as Bonnie's saying, some of it might be like, oh, if I move this scene to this place, then it has this other impact.
Right.
So you might put in a column like some of the key characters who are going to pop up here and there, so you can sort of see, because one of my issues is always, did someone disappear for a long period of time?
Yeah. They tend to do that.
They wander off,
draft.
damn it. Some of them just stroll away, right? So thinking about, you know, like, who is it? It's not Nolan is the dad, but who's the guy who's working kind of against Nolan?
Nick Moore.
Yeah. So, you know, like, when does he show up? Where does he show up?
Right.
You know, is there a way to kind of combine that with, you know, scenes with the Japanese mafia? Like, so for me, then it becomes this thing around, where are these people? How often are they showing up? If they're not showing up very often, you know, would it be better to collapse them in with another character? Like, am I making it unnecessarily complicated?
Well, I don't know if it could be any more complicated than it already is. That's my so my question is, you know, the questions that I've got is, okay, as I'm going through this, do I have a good page turner that people are going to continue read, and I've got enough subplots, and are the subplots you know, viable enough? Again, I don't want to start, you know, scene by, you know, page by page editing until I go, oh, I need to move this over there, and I may have to anyway. You know, I was just trying to see if I could do this sort of shortcut it a bit. But I do like the idea of, you know, where do the characters show up, because Moore is kind of an important character. And I like the idea of having a subplot, you know, by column, so that I can go, oh yeah, here's this plot, here's where it all shows up, and then and I do have to, you know, close each one of them and it's sort of like the first subplot is David is fired, right? He's the first sort of thing that happens. He's fired, and at the end of the book, he gets asked if he wants to teach at the National Ballet School.
And I think I'm going to pull you back in terms of talking about, what do we think a subplot means?
Well, a little, I sort of see it as a separate story with a kind of beginning, middle, and end that's attached to your main story.
Yeah. Because and I would agree with that. But so I would think about, like, what are the stories that are happening within this? So there is the story of what's happening with Leah.
Right.
Right. So where is she? How do I save her?
Right.
Right. There's the story that's happening around what's basically the science that's behind all of this. The fact that people are looking for her blood, like that's sort of an explanation, but it's its own thing. There's the plot that I think it's around, I would say the subplot is really around David's purpose.
Right.
Which is related to money and status,
right.
but not completely.
Right.
And then looking for, where are those things come in? Where can you put those in conflict?
Right.
Which you have. Like in terms of your big highest level question, there's a lot of really interesting stuff in here.
Okay.
Like, so for me, because when, I print it out, I think it comes out to like basically, page and a half, 2 pages.
Right.
At that high level stuff, I'm interested. And I think there's interesting things. So thinking about how you can set those things in conflict with each other, how they might play against each other in terms of one balancing off another, either supporting it or making the other thing harder, is always useful and interesting.
Right. Okay. Okay.
All right.
Okay.
So I will have you. Anyone else want to chime in on anything with Tony's subplots? Bonnie, I wonder if you could comment, what would you say the main plot of your dragon story is, and what are some of the subplots?
The main plot of my dragon story is the survival of the dragons, defeating the plague and surviving. The subplots involve the magic of the world and how it's changed the world, and this is going to affect what happens with the main plot. There's a subplot of overcoming victimization, and there's another subplot of powered versus unpowered people.
And see, I think of those, when you're talking about those as subplots, I think of those as themes.
Yes, I tend to think of my subplots as themes
that
tie into and support the plot. That's just the way my mind tends to think. And so my subplots tend to demonstrate those themes or work through those themes.
Yeah. And I think that's maybe not a bad way of tackling it, like thinking in terms of what are the various things that I want to explore. So thinking in terms of sub-theme or, themes within that may be useful. And I called on Bonnie because I know this dragon book, because I've read large chunks of this dragon book. So it's easier for me because I can see it, where I would say, the overall question I would agree is, are these dragons going to survive? So the main plot is around finding these dragon eggs, getting these dragon eggs to survive. And both the dragons are worried about that in one shape. And then Becca, one of the characters, is worried about that. Then there's sort of a whole subplot around, which is kind of related to that, but which is like, can dragons and humans coexist? Which,
that's the whole series subplot.
So that's something that came up multiple times within that. And, I certainly was thinking a lot about that. There's a subplot of a romance that's happening sort of between Becca and Trey, which is one of the characters. So are they going to get together? Those kinds of things. So all of those things are kind of nesting together. And as a reader, I'm wanting, like, can we get back to certain things? And so, the challenge then for Bonnie is, oh gosh, we haven't had a scene between Becca and Trey in a while. And you started this kind of romantic pants feelings between the two of them. And now I want to see what's going to happen.
Right.
Leslie, you had a question.
There we go. Yes, I'm okay. I understand what my subplots were in the last novel, and in the new novel, I've never written multiple points of view, so I have 3 points of view that are all interconnecting. And the subplots that I think I have are the relationships between 2 of the main characters, their son and his wife, which will eventually be a different book, and between one of the main character's son and the other main character's daughter, and there's like relationship things going on that are filtered in through the story but not resolved. Like, I don't know, is that a subplot?
Yes, because I mean, we are talking, kind of going back to what Tony said, we're talking about that kind of secondary stories that the reader is interested in as the story is going along.
Okay, good.
I'm not sure how many people, if anyone has read The Party by Robin Harding. It's a thriller. It's, free disclosure, whatever. Robin and I are friends, so I like her as well as a writer. But The Party is all about, but shockingly, a party where a family, their daughter is turning 16. She has a party in their basement, like a slumber party with a bunch of her girlfriends over. And like all things, it's all fun and games until someone loses an eye. So there's a young girl who actually falls through a glass coffee table and loses an eye at this party. And then it is kind of all the ramifications as this blows through this suburban community about who's to blame. And of course, it turns out the girls had some alcohol at the party, and, were they being sort of supervised sufficiently, and what's going to happen to all of these various people because of this thing that happened. Having said that, there is a whole subplot between the wife and the husband where there's some dishonesty. There may be some extramarital things that are going on within that, right? So there's a subplot around what's going to happen between the two of them. The daughter is a character point of view as well in the story, and you're finding out that, of course, she is not being fully honest with her parents about various things that are happening within the school and some of the political dynamics that are going on. So the subplots also feed and make the main plot more complicated and difficult because the two couples, the husband and wife, are lying to each other about other things that have nothing to do with this party. But because they're lying to each other about those other things, that complicates the main story. And I think that's really the challenge for us, is not having subplots as this totally separate, like this is a thing that's happening, but can it be used to make the main plot more difficult, and or can it be used to resolve it? So if Becca and Trey get together and form a loving, bonded relationship, does that assist Becca in doing what she needs to do to save the dragons? Or conversely, does the fact that she's, distracted with romance cause problems with saving the dragons? And what choices do people have to make there? So I think that is the big challenge with subplots.
I read you ever read The Passage by Justin Cronin?
Yes.
So I really liked the first book, and I got the second one out of the library, and this was like 2 or 3 years ago. And he had some subplot that went, like, was almost a whole separate book. And I remember reading it going, what are you doing? Like, wasn't connected to the main story. And I don't think I even finished the book. I just lost interest in it.
Yeah, I got through book 2 and I struggled. There was book 3. And I don't think I ever finished book 3. Speaking of, The Passage is going to be made into a TV show. I don't know if you know that's coming up. Yeah. So there's a plug-in for that for them. But I think basically trying to figure out, this is a story about X. That is my main thing. Then there's other things are happening within that are either supporting that thing or making that thing more difficult. But if they are totally divorced from it altogether, you're going to have a challenge. Sometimes for me, it does help to figure out, what are events versus a plot. So some things are just happening, but it's not really a story. It's just a thing that's happening to the characters. Mm-hmm. And then I'm always going back to this kind of idea of theme. Like, is this subplot showing maybe a different perspective on that? So for example, and again, not to pick on poor Bonnie, but because I've read her book, so I know it really well. When I think about the subplots around the idea that you need to stand up for yourself, that is weaving in, and different characters are doing that at different times. And it becomes the question of, when do you put yourself second? And is that a loving thing to do? You can argue yes. Or is it the wrong thing to do? Should you be putting your own mask on first? And so that theme is showing up in magic. It's showing up between the two different dragons. It's showing up between the two different characters. It's showing up between Becca and her mother, as well as Becca and Trey. So it's a theme that's popping up in several of these different storylines that is then being reinforced the different sides of that. So in that case, Becca with her mom, she has put herself, like she has tried so hard to please someone who cannot be pleased. And then with Trey, she's going to have to find the balance around when do you give into that versus when is it not good to give into that. So those, I think, are some things to think about. So for me, going back to Tony's story, which is thinking around how can something like the Japanese mafia, which shows up and are causing trouble, which I just love that they showed up, because really you can't go to Tokyo and not drag in the Japanese mafia. Like, you know, where are they on this idea of loyalty, which is a thing that David is dealing with? Where are they on the issue of money? Is it money before everything? And I don't think so. I think and my vast knowledge of the Japanese mafia coming from books that I've read only, is I have the sense, just like sort of the US or, you know, North American mafia, that money is obviously a big thing, but less so than honor and loyalty.
Right.
So, you know, thinking about, is there a way to, you know, as the mafia is in there, like, do they make a choice that shows that angle, right? So that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I actually have, how I'm writing that is, I'm actually going to have them more on the good side of the antagonist, as opposed to, you know, cutting and slicing and dicing. So that's sort of what's going on in my head.
And I think that's the interesting thing, like thinking about, you know, Nolan and his daughter, like what are the choices that he's making there? Why is he making those choices? Thinking about those things and how those can then play out. Because, I mean, he's kind of, you know, he's a bad dude, right? So he's willing to.
Yeah.
But that also plays out. Then you can look at, you know, how many people are going to use David because of the knowledge that he has, right? Mm-hmm. All of those things become a way to sort of stream that in. So I think we actually probably made this more complicated for you and not less, Tony. You're welcome. Come again to office hours, people.
That's right.
Come, bring your story.
That'll be $50.
That'll be $50. But I do think the things that I would do that I think will help is I would do a bullet point breakdown of scenes, just so you can see exactly what scenes that you have already, because it might tell you what could be cut,
right,
or what could be combined. I would maybe make a column that just has what people are in this, so you know where people are and where they're showing up.
Yep.
And then maybe just to think about, like, what are the couple of themes that are going through?
Yep.
And maybe looking to see where are those coming up. And that may help you distill down what the subplots need to be.
Okay. I'd love to see, was it Bonnie that had you had the spreadsheet? Oh, I love spreadsheets.
Spreadsheets are fun. Yeah, I tend to think in themes, but yes, really I should be defining my subplots as the romance subplot, the magic subplot, the what does the world want from these individual subplots.
And you know what? I don't care if you call them what you call them. As long as you resolve them and that they add to the story and don't take away, like you talked about in that passage book. And I think you do see books where you can just hijack a story and lose it.
The last question I have is, I don't have a romantic interest in this for David. I had it in the last one, but not this one. And I'm wondering, do I have to put one in? Do they? Because one hasn't sort of showed up as I wrote it.
I'm going to argue.
Leia then.
What's that?
She's 13.
Why does he save Leia?
She's 13.
She's 13.
So let's hope he doesn't.
Okay.
But I think it is. It is a romance subplot in that it is about love.
Right.
So I would look at how can you build that he falls in love with Layla, not in a romantic sexual way.
Right.
But he doesn't have a lot of emotional connections in his life.
Right.
So if he comes to care for her, then, because rescuing her isn't just about being a brave dude. And you have down here, I'm trying to remember. Hang on, I'll find it.
Well, what happens is he realizes he he recognizes her. She reminds him of somebody, and then at the end, at the sort of the climax, he realizes that Leah is Jonathan's daughter from a previous relationship, and that's sort of a big reveal at the end.
Which is a nice little twist.
Yeah. And so he's been sort of being paternal to her all this time, not really knowing quite why. And so, okay.
But I would play on that and, dig into your feelings as a dad around, because initially it's not going to be instantaneous for him, right? But he comes to care for her, and even more than I think he thinks that he does. And I think this is your romance subplot.
Right, okay.
Which is him building a relationship with someone. So not in a sexual way, but in an emotional way. Like, how does she challenge him to think about things? How does she push him to be a better man?
Right. Okay.
That's what I would think about.
Okay.
Be a better man, David. Damn it. We're counting on you. All right. We ran a little bit over, but I appreciate it for everyone. So I hope you have a wonderful January 2nd. I don't know if people are taking time off this week, but if so, I hope you enjoy that, a little bit of extra free time, and was excited to see so many people in sprints. So I think we're all off to the races.
Off to a good year.
Off to a good year. And off you go to do whatever it is that you have going for the day.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.